Sir Simon Jenkins. As you probably know, he's a journalist, author and broadcaster. In the course of his 50-year career, he has written in and edited both the London Evening Standard, the Times, and has authored books on politics and the history and architecture of London. For the past 20 years, he has written regularly on different aspects of localism and has continually made the case for decentralisation examples, which we'll talk about later. He currently has a regular column in The Guardian, which I'm sure many of you read, and is a deputy chairman of English Heritage and was a member of the Millennium Commission. So I'd just like to kick off and ask Simon, what do you think the coronavirus crisis has told us about the government's approach to local government?
Well, it's always interesting to me that every government that comes to power always says it believes in localism and wants to decentralize and does the exact opposite. It's very rare that it gets an opportunity to do the exact opposite within a few months of taking office. And what I think is very interesting, the governments show themselves, I think, when there's a crisis. In a sense, they show themselves in their true colors. And I do think that what's been so interesting to anyone interested in localism is the way in which the localist aspect of the British Constitution effectively collapsed. And central government took over obsessively. It tried to set up new institutions, new volunteer forces. It tried in effect to run the country as a crisis from the centre. And it did so, in my view, very badly. And I think when this comes to be assessed, when people look at other countries, how they handled it, you will see that almost invariably it was better when it was handled locally. In Britain, and I know this from friends in local government was completely ignored. And I think as a result of that, they've had terrible trouble catching up. So essentially, it has been a trial, a test case in localism in action. And at the moment, I think it's...
Sorry, has Simon gone offline there, or is that my internet?
Simon, we've lost you briefly.
Have you got me at the moment?
Back. Yes, you're back.
Okay. The government failed, I ended up with saying.
And so why do you think there is... Gosh.
It might be worth Simon taking his video off.
Please excuse our slight technical difficulties. If you'll hold one moment, we will hopefully have Simon back with us in just a second.
Working. They had a business.
Have you got me now?
Yes, we have you.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay. No. I'm touching nothing, but
that's Simon. That's fine, Simon.
Okay.
So sorry, I think you got to you were telling us that the government has failed.
That was my concluding sentence. Yes, back to you.
Okay. So why do you think that there is this instinct for central government to pull inwards when there are so many people in and around government, and a lot of people would argue that the Brexit vote told the government that the people want power closer to them.
Concluding sentence. Yes, back to you. Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me right?
I can now, yeah.
Yes, okay. It's fairly clear that you have a group of people in government now who do not have experience of localism in any sense. Boris Johnson was he did not have experience, charismatic mayor, but he wasn't a localist mayor. And I think they found themselves in a situation where they had a major crisis. They really didn't know what to do. The central government machine was dependent on the government centralized, nationalized industry. They had absolutely no of deselling. We really didn't know what machine. Very interesting to see how difficult it is coping with the crisis. A major crisis like this. If you haven't got if you haven't got some sort of control over the local, how difficult it is to get control of a major local government.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bad line, isn't it?
We're struggling with the line. We'll give it just a moment.
Did you hear any of that? I think that have experience with a charismatic mayor, but he wasn't a major crisis. Did you hear any of that?
It came out a little bit sort of mashed together. I was broken up a little bit. I don't know whether you're able to try a different line.
Meanwhile, whilst we try and get Simon on a working line, I failed to invite people to use the chat function to submit comments and questions. And indeed, if anybody would like to signal that they would like to come in, whilst I hope we'll be able to get an introduction from Simon, I would like to invite people to participate in the discussion. Simon, I think you're back with us. Have you got any headphones, Simon? That might help.
Do we have headphones?
Yeah, headphones.
We have headphones.
So bear with us one moment, and again, apologies for the problems at the moment. This is for those that are joining us for the first time. This is the first time we've actually struggled over the internet on air. I think what is our 12th Radix webinar since lockdown. So please excuse the frustration that you're.
I don't have a significant amount of this particular.
I can certainly confirm that a lot of our news conferences are happening like this at the moment. It's been quite
very well.
It's been quite difficult to get some breaking news done.
Simon,
I can hear Rachel.
Great. Okay, we can hear you. We'll give it one more go, and then perhaps I'll ask you to call in on a landline. I'll send you the details now.
Okay.
But let's give it a go.
Okay, Rachel.
Okay, I'll perhaps start from the beginning then, just in case that there were some people who couldn't hear us.
So what really flow from question mark?
Sorry. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Please, can everybody make certain that they are muted?
Okay, I'll start again. So Simon, what do you think the coronavirus crisis has told us about this government's approach to localism and decentralising power?
I think it's told us that it doesn't understand about localism at all. I think it came to power believing apparently in decentralisation and localism, because that's what Boris Johnson said. He found himself with a crisis that put that promise immediately to the test, and he was found wanting. He had no mechanism for projecting central control locally in such a way that he could combat this particular disease. And it was very interesting. If you compare it with other countries, almost all of them relied on local government to enforce the lockdown and the various regulations of lockdown, and then cope with testing and the other aspects of it that were required to combat the disease. Britain, the system simply broke down, and the NHS, in effect, was left trying to handle it itself. And the NHS, of course, had its own interests. It had nothing to do with local government. And I think we have seen really localism as such fail in Britain in a spectacular way.
I think we've seen, sort of, just from my point of view as a reporter, I've seen quite a few examples of it not working. For example, the government shared data on people who are shielding with supermarkets, but not with councils. And the same thing, we've had a lot of problem with local resilience fora just because of the information not being shared with them. Can you think of a few examples of during this time of just things that you thought would have worked so much more easily if we had just different structures in place?
Oh, I have absolutely no doubt that this is a disease which is primarily about old people. Old people are one of the few areas which is local government's responsibility, the care of the elderly. They're in charge of care homes, the inspection of care homes and so on. and they were left absolutely stranded with this appalling business of having patients dumped on them by the NHS. You did not have a situation, I followed it quite closely down here in Wales, where the local people, however you define them, the local council, the parish council, the leaders of the local community, who would have been ideally placed to enforce what I believe should have been a voluntary lockdown, would have known who was disobeying it, would know who needed protecting, all those local contacts, which are the fabric of local government in Britain. All of them were there in place, but none of them were used. And the result has been a disaster. I really think so. Britain's been shamed by it.
And how would you say that we compare to other European countries who have a more decentralised structure? You know, sort of talk about France or perhaps Norway. How do we compare? What are they doing better than we are?
Well, but it's difficult to say better at this stage because we don't know the full outcome. But it's fairly clear that Britain was one of the worst in performance. It's fairly clear that countries like not just Korea and Taiwan, but Norway and Germany and France, where they in effect conscripted local government to do the testing, to do the tracing, to see what sorts of lockdown were most effective, and also the ones that were ineffective. Where, I mean, down here in Wales, some really pointless regulations were introduced. You weren't allowed to walk on a mountain, but you could walk on a beach. Why? All these things are just ridiculous. And when the people on the ground regard them as ridiculous, they lose faith in the way in which this is being enforced. They're not there on the side with government, and they should have been on side with government. Do you think
the reason we are such a centralised country is because of a national mood and their relationship with their local council? Or why do you think there is this culture of centralised government in our country?
Well, it goes way back. We don't have a constitution which stipulates localism. We have an informal constitution which places all power in the parliament, the national parliament. Governments come to power promising to do things. They don't promise to decentralize, they promise to do things. I started out before as a journalist working with the Redcliffe Maud Commission on Local Government. I studied these things, became obsessed with it before I was even writing about it. But no, I mean, there is something in England, particularly in England, deeply centralist. People come to politics as they think they're the local mayor when they're an MP. They don't like local government. They rather despise local government. They want to be seen to be doing things themselves and to be credited with doing things. And that's why they centralize.
And yet you find that in many, many ways that much more innovation at a local level, and just that they kind of are a lot better at doing things. I mean, I was actually watching the Local Government Association, one of their seminars today, and they were pointing out that they have electronic voting while they're watching Westminster MPs, you know, do this sort of really long snake around the building to be able to vote. So how do you think we move on from here? How do you think people who support rather more localism, what's the best way of making that argument to the current government at this time?
You make a very good point. The point about localism is innovation. You try it somewhere and see if it works. The United States of America is a perfect example of that. States try things out. It's fascinating to watch drug law reform in America at the moment. It may be interesting to watch police law reform. We don't know yet. But where you've got diversity, you have the opportunity to try things out and see if they work. And time and again, I find I'm looking abroad to see where things happen, how they happen, where the experiments are taking place. You just don't see it in this country at all. If you take the policing, in Robert Peel's day, policing was essentially a local activity. It required the consent of people to allow other people to arrest them. If it wasn't local, they wouldn't believe in it. Now, the policing is essentially centralized. Talk to council, they are doing things to targets set by Whitehall. You've lost that degree of local accountability. And I think where you do it, you get disobedience. You get crime. It applies right across the board. The removal of schools from local government, I think, was a huge pity. It removed the most proud institutions that a local council had and gave it in effect to the local government, to the central government, to take credit for it. I honestly do think, having campaigned for this for so many years, I do think it's very difficult to see how you're going to beat it. You're dealing with power. Power at the center is the most powerful of all powers. We're seeing it in China at the moment. It's no good telling them it's a bad idea. They know it's a bad idea, but something deep inside them instinctively desires to centralize it. And that's why I think, rather reluctantly, I mean, I think we may have Vernon Bogdanor here who is good on this. I think we've got to find a way constitutionally of entrenching localism. It was very interesting. The most centralist country in Europe was France. France was ever since Napoleon, it was legendary for the degree of centralism, the local inspectorate, the local directors and so on. It's only when a mayor, Mitterrand, became president, that he said it's going to stop. And they forcibly empowered mayors in the same way that they have them in Spain and Italy, and certainly in Germany. The local government in these countries is more powerful, it's more effective, it's more believed, and that's the way.
How do you think that the local lockdowns, because the government is very keen for such huge things to be handled on a local level, do you think there's, I'm reluctant to sort of use the word opportunity at a time like this, but do you think it's a good time to start talking about how you decentralize powers more?
I think it is a good time. I think even central government must know that something went wrong in the connecting rods between central government and localism, local effectiveness of policy. Something went wrong. This week, poor Leicester, here on the radio, they're going to be locked down again. I mean, it was a complete absurdity. And then Boris Johnson and the mayor of Leicester accused each other of lying. There's clearly something should be done here. And I would have thought that if there's going to be, if we're now entering the age of the pandemic, government has got to establish a network of local government, local authorities that are able to implement its policy on the ground.
Okay, I don't know if some people would like to join in now. I've seen a lot of people have submitted some really interesting questions. So I'll go to Joe Zamet Lucia. He said, in many people's eyes, localism has become associated with the words postcode lottery, and we do hear this all of the time. He said, have the British people come to prefer mediocre uniformity to diversity?
The answer to that question is easy, yes. I mean, I blow up whenever I hear postcode lottery. I said, do you mean democracy? Postcode lottery means difference. It means trying things out. It means not being the same as your neighbor or your neighboring authority. And it's become a term of centralist abuse. We must diverge. We must do things differently, or we're never going to do them better. At the moment, we really are doing them probably, as the questioner says, at the lowest common denominator. And there's not a sensible way of running a country. It really isn't.
I guess the counterpoint to that is that a lot of people will point to the post-war consensus where you had all citizens get a certain standard. How do you reply to that when some politicians even will argue that, well, you don't want areas to fall behind. You want them, like, to use Boris Johnson's word, you want everywhere to be levelling up. What's the reply to that argument? That
well, we don't run the economy on the basis that everybody has to go at the same speed as the slowest member. You cannot make everyone everywhere equal. It's not going to work that way. When you try to standardize hospital A&E admissions rates, they all slow down because everyone's trying to hit the target. You want people to do what local people want. People in Cornwall are going to want different things from their local authority from people in Yorkshire. It stands to reason. You clearly, in a modern democracy, you want, if you like, a universal basic standard of welfare. That has to go without saying. But you don't need the same parks and gardens. You don't need the same home health care, possibly. Some authorities have got large numbers of old people, some large numbers of young people. The ethnic diversity of areas are going to diverge. You cannot standardize these things. And when they tried to standardize lockdown, it was a very interesting example, I think. They tried to standardize lockdown and they were imposing ridiculous rules. Say around here that you can't move more than 5 miles from your home. Well, 5 miles in Cardiff is different from 5 miles in Snowdonia. you end up with absurdities, all I'm saying. It is not a sensible way of ruling a country.
How do you think the metro mayors that we have, I mean, we've got Teesside, Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham. How do you think they're getting on? Do you think they're making a good case for more localism?
I don't really, because it's been a very half-baked way of going about mayors. We proposed on a local government commission back in the 90s, and we intended there to be elected mayors for cities. These are not mayors for cities. Only the London one is, but the others aren't. They're mayors for regions. I mean, the elected mayor of Manchester doesn't run Manchester. That's run by the leader of the Manchester City Council. He doesn't run Birmingham. That's run by the leader of the Birmingham Council. The mayor of Bristol is also the mayor of Bath. That is ridiculous. They have deliberately, in my view, been wrecked by Whitehall, so they don't have enough power. They're basically chairman of regional committees of mostly transport authorities. So they haven't really worked. It's exciting where good people like Andy Burnham and Andy Street have stood for power. It's good that they're in their position there, and they do speak up for their region. But they're not what I wanted. I wanted Mayor Bloomberg in Birmingham and Manchester. That's what we wanted, and we didn't really get it. One or two places have got it. I mean, the mayor of Hackney has done very well. The mayor of Leicester is rather good news. I mean, there are some good people there, but it is not universal. Tony Blair was persuaded, but then was persuaded to have a plebiscite to see if they really wanted them. So there were very few. It hasn't really worked. I'd love to see it galvanized.
Okay, I'll go to another question from some people that are listening in. Would it have been any different with Blair, Cameron, or May during this time? How much of the problem was Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, as opposed to UK ways of working and do you think?
Well,
the response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. It really is. I mean, a lot of it focuses on the personality of Boris Johnson, almost obsessively, wanting to show he's doing something without necessarily having a grasp of what he's doing. You also had something which is only beginning to emerge now, which is a collapse in the relationship between the political element of government and the executive element. The great tradition of British government is you have a machine there whose job it is to execute the decisions of government. Where the politicians have lost faith in them, and it's clear they have at the moment. And then when you have a crisis, which requires the executive arm of government to be extremely efficient, it did break down. It clearly broke down. So I think it has to be said. I do think that Thatcher, Major, and Cameron would have probably done a little better. Interestingly, if you go back to Thatcher, a great friend of mine was a permanent secretary who passionately disagreed with her on everything. He said she was the most successful prime minister he ever worked for because he came into the office and knew exactly what he had to do. And that was the key to a good executive. The politician directs, the civil service executes, and that has not worked this time.
No, and I'm going to go to another one. So from William Harley, how local, he says, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, all locally run and seem to be doing better than England. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, living in Wales at the moment, I'm not totally sure. But I mean, setting aside the Celtic fringe, which I love, I believe in extreme localism. There's no question about it. I believe parish councils should be much more powerful, as they are in, for instance, America or in France. They should have mayors, they should have real power, they should have tax-raising powers, they should have duties they spend their money on, and the more local, the better. At the moment, you're going to see them removed from the planning system, from the care system. Almost everything that local government's ever taken any pride in at all going to be taken away from local government by this government, and that's a great pity. But no, I mean there are tiers of local government always. They are extremely expensive. They're sometimes wasteful. They're sometimes dilatory, but they are democratic. And damn it, we're talking about democracy here. Yeah,
I remember. But you were just speaking about when Blair tried to devolve more power. I remember just from my part of the world. I'm from County Durham. I remember the referendum and the argument that was made against it. Which Dominic Cummings actually was very involved in. The big they made this white elephant which was there to sort of, refer people to this white elephant in the room of more spending, more money on, more office and more bureaucracy. That was the argument. I'm going to go now to Stephen Smith, who asks, how can we redress this balance quickly? Much is linked to the NHS, which in itself admitted command and control mode.
Yes.
The experience. Sorry, Stephen, if you want to ask the question, that's no problem at all. Go for it.
Thank you, Simon. Very much on to you with the video issue. If you look at Stockholm, the Swedish and the Germans, for example, the NHS, which is our great religion and which has been unbelievably performing over the last 3 months. I'm a chair of a trust and a lifelong professor of medicine in the country. Should we start with the NHS in trying to localize it? Sweden, basically the local NHS is responsible to the local authority effectively. And famously in the Germans with the Länder, they didn't do the central testing. It was the Länder who said to the federal government, we will do the testing, thank you very much. And when we've sorted out, you can come back and talk to us. Maybe we should start by looking at the NHS.
I can only totally agree. The NHS is a real problem. It reminds me of the medieval Catholic Church. I mean, you cannot criticize it. It clearly has failed. I have a connection with a care home, and it was just outrageous to have these people dumped on you, untested, infected. It was a staggering decision taken. One of the successes, very few, I think, of George Osborne was he did get the NHS in Manchester delegated to Manchester.
Yes.
London failed to do the same thing. London had a very good NHS before the war. No, I'm right with you. I think you cannot have these vast bureaucracies running these personal services. They are not efficient.
Yes. You can also link it up to the social services, which of course are locally provided.
I agree. There's nothing to be said for the present system. But my worry is what they're going to do is they're going to take the social services and the care homes into a national body like the NHS. We can have things made worse rather than better.
Is that called doubling down?
I believe it is, yes.
Another thing that's come up with, I just wanted to mention it while we're on, Boris Johnson mentioned a lot this week about liberalising planning laws, and that, during this time we'll need to build, as he puts it. Do you see how difficult that might be for local people who may want the economy to recover, but they don't necessarily want loads of building on their doorstep that they don't agree with? And then how do you think about how you localize decisions but not allow it to turn into NIMBYism, not in my backyardism?
Well, NIMBYism is a centralizer's phrase. Until you've got a backyard, the other person's a NIMBY. When you've got one of your own, you are. I mean, you have to decide if you want local government, local democracy. If you believe that you people in communities have some right to decide how that community should develop, and I think most of us think they should, then you can't then say, oh, you can't have what we don't agree with. You've got to delegate some power over planning decisions. They're proposing to give these powers to centralist commissions. There'll be hell. There'll be endless references to the courts. People will be appealing against decisions endlessly. If you don't involve local people in planning, even if it's corrupt, which it often is, and not just on the continent, but also here, if you don't involve local people in planning, there'll be trouble. People want to be able to influence the way their community develops. They will not take kindly to being told it by the central government, whatever the central government's policy may be.
And I think it's probably been demonstrated over the last couple of weeks with how Robert Jenrick has handled the West Ferry development, just how open to abuse it may be if it's too far centralised, I guess you would argue.
Well, I tell a story of an Italian friend of mine. I took him to Waterloo Bridge and showed him the skyline of London, which he hadn't seen for some years. He screamed. He said, I come from the most corrupt city in the world, and we wouldn't do that to our city. I mean, you're left gasping with what happens when central government says you can have a shard, you can have a walkie-talkie, you can have this over the wishes of local government. It wasn't necessarily the case in those cases, but nonetheless, you've got to decide who is going to have these decisions. If you constantly battle between local and central tends to win, you end up with, frankly, the skyline you've got in London at the moment.
I'm going to go to another question. Chris Toddhunter, would you like to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read out?
Yes, I would. Thank you. It seems that there's a great need for international cooperation on one hand, and greater powers for local government on the other, and that national governments will be mostly trumped by international business, especially financial business. Yet taxation is the card which is held by nation states. Would a change in taxation policy make a difference to encourage localism?
Well, if you're saying should local taxes be more discretionary to local authorities, I think the answer is yes. Again, in this country, local taxes are fixed by the centre. That's not the case in America. It's not the case in Germany. It's not the case in most other countries. Some discretion lies with locality as to decide how much to tax and for what. Most people don't mind so much paying local taxes, curiously, when they know what it's going to be spent on. They resent paying central taxes because they don't know what it's going to be spent on, or they disagree with it. But yes, I mean, I simply think, you ask about international, all government is tiered. There are central governments, there are international governments, there's the European governments, and there's local governments. There's often two tiers of local government. It's complicated. Democracy is complicated. You've just got to, if you like, legislate for those tiers, make sure they're clear, people know where they are, and decide at which level you're going to tax people. It will not be simply a national system. Britain has a totally national system now. And I think the result is people locally really don't feel empowered in any way by the way in which they're being governed.
The question is, though, who decides on the taxation system?
Well, in this country, the decision on what the system should be is decided by central government. I think local authorities ought to have far wider tax-raising powers, and they should be able, for instance, at the moment, to decide how much they ought to be taxing businesses, which is now a crippling burden on some businesses. But the decision on how to do it is central. The decision on what the tax rate should be, I think, should be much more devolved.
And I think we have a question from Tom Brake. Would you like to ask yourself, Tom? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Very happy to ask. Is there the potential for the relationship between local authorities and businesses to improve significantly? Because one thing that local authorities seem to have done very well is very rapidly hand out very large amounts of cash to businesses in a way that perhaps no one would have thought they were capable of doing. So does that form the basis for a better relationship with businesses? And of course, that relationship has got to be solid to ensure that there's a decent recovery.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. These are the payments made under the government scheme, but through local authorities?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we are in exceptional circumstances at the moment. And I was actually rather pleased that at least they trusted local government to do this. It illustrates what you can do if you do trust local government. In the longer term, I think the relationship between business and local government is a very critical one. It's been snapped really by the business rating system. The central government took that under its own power, and now it's trying to devolve it again. The trouble with local taxation in Britain is it keeps changing. And it keeps changing because central government, each government comes into power with a new idea for it. If only people knew where they stood, they knew what their tax rates are going to be from one year to the next, I think it'd be much better. But that relationship has essentially to be between the business and the local authority, not the business of central government. There is no doubt at all, it opens up to corruption. Italy and Spain, I know, there's terrible corruption in this relationship between business and local government. You've just got to cope with that and police it. But it's better that it's local. Someone said to me, I'd rather have a corrupt local authority than one that doesn't have any power.
Okay, could we go to Charlotte? Because I'm just conscious we haven't had, other than myself, another female yet. Would Charlotte like to ask a question?
Hi, so My question is the extent to which localism as a process needs to be constitutionally enacted. Does it need a coherent set of structural reforms or, ironically, perhaps top-down reorganisation? Or do you think the process of devolution by deal-making should be the way forward?
I think the first and not the second is the answer. It's a very good question. I'm absolutely convinced now that, I mean, years of worrying about this, there is simply no way governments are going to voluntarily surrender power ad hoc on particular issues. You have got to legislate, you've got to make a system robust, that local government has powers over particular areas of the economy and society. And those powers are over against the centre. It's got to be constitutional. It's no good any longer governments coming to power and saying, oh, I believe in localism, and then doing centralism. You can't do it that way. And I think that unless you go down the route that most European countries have gone down, where provinces, districts, even parishes have systematic powers that they are theirs, and they can take government to court if it refuses to let them to exercise those powers. It won't happen. So I believe in constitutional change, yes.
Okay, and then there's an Alan Davison who asks, would more regionalism offer better value for money? For example, local contractors use, for example, we would use local contractors rather than companies like KPMG or Circle.
As far as the example is concerned, I totally agree, yes. Regionalism is a problem. Britain has never been a regional country, or England has never been a regional country. Be very careful here. Regional devolution has never worked. Someone was asking before about Durham, or you were asking about Durham.
Yeah.
When Prescott, I had a conversation with Prescott about this, when Prescott tried to get a regional assembly for the Northeast, he was an idiot. He wanted it to be Northumberland, Durham, and I think a bit of Yorkshire, I'm not quite sure. And no one wanted that. I know for a fact, someone said to me, if you want a regional assembly for Northumberland, yes, we go for that. And the reason is that they identify with it. People identify with Cumbria, they identify with Cornwall, they identify with Yorkshire. Where you have an entity which has a feeling of local coherence, democracy applies. If you've carved out a chunk of England, like the same as Selneck, Southeast Lancashire, Northeast Cheshire or something, or Humberside or Avon, these are meaningless entities that no one feels any identity or loyalty to, and they will not work as a democratic body. The things that work were counties. I just believe passionately in counties because people identify with them. I'm Yorkshire, I'm Suffolk, I'm whatever it is. Now, they're not very efficient. You can make them one-purpose authorities if you like, but the Northeast, the Southeast is not a democratic entity. And I just don't think it'll ever work in that way. It works for Wales, it works for Scotland, it works for Northern Ireland. It does not work for England.
You think, I guess, that devolution has to be connected to history then? Because, you know, you would connect a lot of counties to history, or?
I think it has to be connected with identity. Mm. Where do people say they're from? We had a test on the Radio Small Commission. We had to decide whether you had a one-tier or a two-tier local authority. And you asked someone on a beach in the Mediterranean where they're from. If their answer was Leeds, Bristol, Southampton, you said, right, one authority, Leeds, Bristol, Southampton. If they said, Blaisbury in Norfolk, that's two authorities. If they identified themselves with a place and then a county, they needed two-tier. If just one place, particular city, is one-tier. And that's because that's where they felt their loyalty lay. It's where their loyalty lies that their democratic responsibility should be.
Okay. David Boyle makes a really good point. Says he very much agrees with a lot of what's being said, but says, isn't the real problem the centralised monopoly power of business? Think back to the sheer diversity of business regionally and locally a century ago. Is that something to do with the loss of local and regional banks? Should we be thinking more about regional and local banks?
Fascinating. I don't know. I wouldn't put too much weight on the question of businesses. I really wouldn't. yes, you had these great nationalized industries in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and they I think contributed to the concentration of power. There's no doubt about that. When you had regional or local railway companies, you had a sense of loyalty to your local railway. When it was British Rail, it was a nationalized industry. I think one of the failings, as we said before, about the NHS, is the NHS became a nationalized industry largely because Bevan and Morrison had a terrible row about whether it should be local or national. Morrison in 1947 wanted it to be local because he was passionately for London. Bevan hated Morrison and said, no, it's going to be national. I want to hear where every bedpan crashes to every floor, he said. I think if you have nationalized industries and national businesses, it does tend towards centralization, yes. Whether you can systematically break things up to make them local, I'm not sure. Maybe the day of the old local bank, the national provincial bank, maybe that should come back. I'm not sure about it.
Do you think that the models we have at the minute, a lot of it is to do with, and this is not my question, it's a question with DH. Is there an issue simply of just lack of lines of communication and essentially trust between central and local government? Is there just a fundamental lack of trust there?
I think there is, yes. They don't live in the same world. The Westminster Village has no lines out to local government. Why I believed in local mayors was I thought there would be some lines out. It was interesting that Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson were both national politicians when they came to the mayoralty of London. They both had got those lines out, and there was, I think, the mayoralty of London has been a success as a mayoralty. But no, you're quite right. There are two separate cultures, really. There's the culture of Westminster and there's the culture of locality. And as the culture of locality has found itself with fewer and fewer powers, I can remember when the local council leader, he ran the schools, he ran the colleges, he ran the care homes. He in every sense was a figure of some power locally. Nowadays, those things are run from central government. And it's very difficult to get people in local government, other than I may say in the property business because of planning, in local government, who really feel as if they're sort of kings of their locality. And that's a very important thing in local government. They've got to feel responsible.
And just William Harley's asked a follow-up question on the last one before last, but we were talking about business. He says most big business is global, not national. And how do you deal with that when you're thinking about localism? How do you get big business to be local?
Well, I don't think you do. I mean, a wise big business that is in the service industry, for instance, is local. I noticed HSBC keeps saying it's your local bank. all the way from Hong Kong. No, I don't think business is an issue here, really. I mean, we're talking about provision of public services for the most part, and public services which are more efficient, in my view, when they're run locally, when there's a local responsibility and local accountability, than when they're run nationally. Where you have bodies like Carril and Serco and so on, who are effectively providing public services through a nationalized industry, they have not been a great success. I'm in favor of privatization in all sorts of ways. But I do think that you tend to find the most efficient local services are provided by the local council with full responsibility and resources raised locally. That to me is the perfect way of running a public service.
And can I get you to sort of take us through what you think the best international models are? We talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but do you think it's the US? Do you think it's Germany? Do you think it's France? Who's the best at localism, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not an expert. I mean, everyone always turns to Scandinavia when they're asked these questions because they think Scandinavia works. And I'm afraid on the whole, Scandinavia does work. I have studied Denmark, and Denmark I think is a very good country to study. It's quite small. It's the same size as Scotland. There's no reason why Scotland and Denmark shouldn't be equally prosperous. I'm afraid Denmark is more prosperous because Denmark's independent. So I'm a nationalist to that extent. Yeah, I think there are things I appreciate in different areas. I mean, I know France a bit. The local village in France is a very powerful entity. It's got a town hall, Hotel de Ville. It's got a mayor. It's always got a mayor. The mayor is usually the most important local citizen. People feel very close to their village. They feel responsible for them, making sure it's got a butcher and a baker and all these local institutions. There's a sense in France of happiness built around the local community. I get the same sense in America. In America, the American small town is built around its democracy. The public meeting in an American small town is a very vigorous place to go. It's a very exciting place to go. None of that in Britain, none of it at all. And I just think we're missing out on so much public life by effectively crippling local democracy in the way we do.
I'm just going to speak up for Charlotte, who has dropped a comment in just while you were speaking there. She says Sweden is an example of a much better integration between local and central government. Says each tier working effectively between each other as much as in their own right. And I wanted to ask, sort of in practical terms, how do you think, Simon, that we get from where we are now to a much better model of government? Because I know you said earlier that you talked about the written constitution earlier potentially, but that's not necessarily going to happen in the short term. How do we make the first steps towards getting different government, do you think?
I was kind of slightly crazy about mayors. I mean, I do believe in mayors very strongly. I think mayors, they're individuals, not party figures. They have to stand on their own personality, their own rights. And when they're in power, they have to do something personally. And although that has all the kind of shortcomings you've seen in London, nonetheless, they are likely to want more power. They're likely to fight for more power. And when they fight for more power and get it, that's the way through to what we've been talking about. It was quite exciting to be involved slightly in the whole issue of how the NHS might be devolved to Manchester. It was sincere. It was really meant. Osborne did mean it. There was a terrific battle in Whitehall. When it got to Manchester, it was very interesting talking to people in Manchester about what difference it made. The chief difference was that people talked to each other. We were talking earlier about the health service and social services. They actually liaised in one city on the provision of the best service they could. That was, in effect, a constitutional change. It was a constitutional decision to break up the NHS in that particular respect. I think the NHS ought to be broken up in that way right across the country. And that would achieve, in one particular area of service, a very real shift. I think you ought to allow, and this would be a government decision, you ought to end rate capping. You ought to allow local authorities to increase rates, maybe under certain conditions, but nonetheless, they ought to be allowed to charge their local people more money for particular services and get voted out of power if they raise rates too much. That's the kind of way you establish contact. And I think that these measures, short of a major constitutional upheaval, these measures are the way in which we're going to do it. Sorry,
Dinesh, did your screen flash there? Was that because you wanted to make a point?
Hi Tim, this is Dinesh. You play golf on Sunday?
I think you potentially just hadn't muted. I'll just read out a couple of comments just because they make some interesting points. Joe Zamet Lucia says, in places like Spain, which like us has a polarized adversarial political system, one of the issues is that central and local government collaboration breaks down when local and central governments are of different colours. And I guess it's I know you talked about you're in favour, Simon, of a top-down reorganisation of it all because it would be harder to wind that back. But I guess you've got that problem, haven't you, of just different parties kind of warring over the issues as well. Well, how do you think sorry, go on.
It's very interesting. I mean, I have to say, if you want to get total agreement, it is Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, everybody else. We need more decentralisation when they don't happen to be in power. Everybody said this over and over again. And it would be wonderful. I think, I don't know if you have a royal commission, something old-fashioned like that, but a commission that actually settles down and says, look, you all agree with decentralisation. You just haven't got the guts to do it. Let's propose a way in which you might do it. And could you please all sign up to it when we've decided on it? It is certainly the case that that central government and local government likes to pass the buck or claim the credit, the two syndromes, and so when they're in different parties, is going to be more the case. But really, we're talking about how Britain should be governed, not the decisions that go into that government, but how it should be governed. And I still think that if we could just agree that it is over-centralised and it needs to be reversed, and we could persuade both parties to go ahead on that basis, we might be able to get somewhere. I'm not very hopeful, but there we are.
Yeah, and I think just to make a point there, that's going to get more difficult perhaps for the Conservatives at the moment, who in Scotland are the main competition to the SNP and very much want to make a pro-union case. So kind of not necessarily going to want to have a lot of these arguments right now. I just sort of would like to finish off on a question from Charlie Duquesne, who says, is there a classic, and I'm not sure if he's a plant from you actually, Simon, is there a classic text to read making the case for localism? Would you refer people to some good texts to read that talk about localism? He's still there?
Oh no.
Oh.
So, we've done so well, particularly after that start. I was absolutely terrified, but it does look like we may have lost Simon. Look, I'll let you pose that question if he makes it back, because I think it's a great question and I want to know his answer. Let me put in some filler. Whilst we wait just to see if Simon can make it back, a couple of adverts. Firstly, for those that haven't yet signed up for the rest of this series, we have a further session on the 13th of July with Lord John Alderdice, the former speaker, the first speaker of the Northern Ireland Parliament, talking about how you make the union work. And then on the 20th of July, we get to him rather more from Charlotte Aldrich from the Centre for Progressive Policy, who will be looking at the economics issue of localism, the economic side of localism. So I think that'll make a great session, and we'll then be publishing around that. 13th and 20th, you can sign up for both on our website. Secondly, quick advert for our sister organisation Politica, which is for 16 to 24-year-olds. They're holding a series of conversations with MPs at the moment, and their next one is with Tim Farron, my former boss, on the 3rd of July. You can again sign up via our website if you are in that age range, and I think there are one or two on this call who are within that range. And if more likely there are people in this age range who have sons and daughters 16 to 24 who are interested, or you would like to get interested in politics, those are a really brilliant introduction. And then lastly to say, Politica, Radix works on a free basis. We don't charge, we're not for profit, we're a charity. That said, if you would care to make a donation to enable us to run these events, we recommend £10, 25 for the series, and you can do that directly from our website, from the donate button on the top right hand corner of our website, and any support you can offer would be very, very much appreciated. Simon, I filled whilst we had lost you.
I'm back. I'm back. If there's any help, are you?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to let Rachel ask her very final question, because it was a.
Yeah, there was just one last question, which was, is there a classic text to read making the case for localism? What would you recommend?
Well, you should have given me notice of that.
Sorry.
I hesitate to say I wrote one once, but no. I mean, what's interesting is you look at almost every inquiry that's been held into British government, and going back to Redcliffe and Maud, every one of them said we need to identify more between public services and local people, and they've said it, and that you can't say it too often. But many of the great texts about it, I mean, what's the one about? I mean, Jane Jacobs, when she's writing about the street, the importance of the street. The one about the book about dancing, I forget what it's called. Bowling Alone. I mean, all these books are about the decay of politics when it loses touch with local people. And that's why I feel so strongly that if politics is to be revived as it ought to be revived as a democratic activity, you've got to go local.
Fantastic. I think that's been, I think, unless anybody has anything else that they want to add, I think that's our hour.
Well, we said we would finish at 7. Can I just give huge thank you first to Simon as our speaker, managing to join us from Mid Wales. That was fantastic, a tour de force, and I really think this is an important theme in terms of where we are and what we're now seeing from COVID. And I think COVID does change the context for all sorts of discussions. So if I may, I'll come back to you, I'll give you a chance to rest back over the next 48 hours, and we'll talk about how we might pick this theme up. Can I also say a huge thank you to Rachel for chairing. That was fantastic, okay. And you took us through at enormous pace and a huge amount of material, and it's really, really appreciated. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. Simon, your book I see has now got a plug from David Boyle in our chat. So for those that didn't catch the names that you spread, that's the one. Big Bang Localism is ever so good, says David. I'm afraid I only scanned it to start this conversation, but I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it now. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope to see you on the 13th of July, and have a good evening and take care. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.